The FBI agents kicked down the reinforced door at 2:47 a.m. on a humid June morning in 2011. Inside the modest two-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica, California, an 81-year-old man reaches for his .357 Magnum. His hands move toward the holes he's carefully cut into the bedroom walls over 15 years. Behind those walls sit 30 firearms, over $800,000 in cash, and enough fake identification to start 10 new lives. But time has run out. Within minutes, James Joseph Bulger Jr., better known as Whitey, will utter the words that end the third longest manhunt in FBI history. "You know who I am," he'll finally admit. "I'm Whitey Bulger." The apartment at 1012 3rd Street has kept its secrets for 16 years. But what agents discover inside will reveal just how a man worth an estimated $50 million lived on $1,145 a month in rent, hiding in plain sight while the FBI searched 3 continents for him. This isn't a story about one property. This is the story of 3 places where America's most wanted gangster built an empire, committed murders, and ultimately made the mistake that brought him down. 26 years earlier, on a January night in 1985, a different property held different secrets. At 799 East 3rd Street in South Boston, a 2-story Cape Cod house sat quiet in the City Point neighborhood. Snow covered the small front yard. Inside, in the kitchen, 26-year-old Deborah Hussey was about to become the 3rd person to die in this house within 2 years. She was the daughter of Stephen Flemy's girlfriend. Flemmy was Whitey Bulger's top lieutenant, his partner in the Winter Hill Gang, and like Bulger, a secret FBI informant. Deborah didn't know what was coming. She'd been driven there by Flemmy himself, told they needed to talk. Kevin Weeks, Bulger's protege, stood in the kitchen, too. He didn't know either. Bulger hadn't told him about this one. What happened next would haunt this property for decades. Bulger's hands wrapped around Deborah's throat. She struggled. The kitchen floor was old linoleum. Her heels scraped against it as she fought for air. When Bulger let go, he thought she was dead. They carried her down to the basement, the same basement where 2 other bodies already lay buried in the dirt floor. But Deborah was still breathing. Flemmy realized it first. He grabbed a rope, looped it around her neck, tied a stick to one end, and twisted until the rope cut through skin, twisted until he was absolutely certain she was dead. Then came the routine they'd perfected twice before. Flemmy removed her teeth with pliers, every tooth. It would make identification harder, they thought. He removed her clothing. Weeks and Flemmy dug into the dirt floor, right next to where Arthur Barrett and John McIntyre were already decomposing. The basement was unfinished, just exposed foundation and cold earth, perfect for what they needed. They buried Deborah Hussey at 3 in the morning. Upstairs, Whitey Bulger went to bed. This house, this ordinary-looking Cape Cod in South Boston, had become what Bulger himself nicknamed the Haunty. 3 murders, 3 bodies in the basement. And the owner of the house, Michael Nee, brother of gang member Pat Nee, had no idea any of it had happened. He was vacationing in Florida. To understand how James Bulger came to own an empire of properties where murder was just another Tuesday night, you have to go back to 1929. September 3rd, Dorchester, Massachusetts. He was born to Irish immigrant parents in a working-class neighborhood where the options were simple: work the docks, join the church, or join a gang. Bulger chose the third path at age 14. His first arrest came that same year. By the time he was 20, he'd earned his nickname. Whitey came from his platinum blonde hair, though he hated the name. Everyone who knew him called him Jim. Only the press and the FBI called him Whitey. His early criminal career was textbook Irish mob, bank robberies, armed robbery, hijacking trucks. In 1956, he landed in some of America's most notorious prisons: Leavenworth, then Alcatraz, then Leavenworth again. He served 9 years in federal custody. 9 years to think, to plan, to learn from other inmates. When he walked out in 1965, he was 36 years old and ready to do things differently. He returned to South Boston and joined the Killeen Gang as an enforcer. This was the 1960s, when Boston's organized crime landscape was dominated by the Italian Patriarca family out of Providence, Rhode Island. The Irish mobs were smaller, scrappier, more territorial. In the early 1970s, gang warfare erupted. The Killeen Gang fought the Mullen Gang for control of South Boston's rackets. Bodies piled up. Donald Killeen himself was torn apart by machine gun fire in Framingham. By 1972, Howie Winter brokered a peace. The gangs merged. They called themselves the Winter Hill Gang, after the Somerville neighborhood where Winter operated. Bulger rose quickly through the ranks. He had something the others didn't. He was smart, calculating. He understood that the real power wasn't in pulling triggers. It was in knowing who to bribe, who to threaten, and who to eliminate before they became a problem. In 1974, something happened that would define Bulger's entire criminal career. The FBI came calling, not to arrest him, to recruit him. Special Agent John Connolly walked into Bulger's world with an offer. Become an informant. Help us take down the Italian Mafia. In exchange, we'll protect you. Connolly was from South Boston, too. He'd grown up in the same housing projects as Bulger. At age 8, Connolly had met the 19-year-old Bulger at a corner drugstore. Bulger had bought him an ice cream. Later, Bulger had saved young Connolly from a beating by an older boy. "Go fight somebody your own size," Bulger had growled. Connolly never forgot it. Now, decades later, Connolly was an FBI agent and Bulger was a rising gangster. The relationship was built on childhood loyalty and South Boston code. Bulger said yes. He became an FBI informant in 1975, but Connolly didn't know what he'd just unleashed. Bulger didn't become an informant to help the FBI. He became an informant to use the FBI. Every piece of information Bulger fed to Connolly was calculated. He gave up the Italians, sure, but he used the FBI relationship to eliminate his Irish competitors, too. He manipulated Connolly into telling him about investigations, about wiretaps, about who was cooperating with police, and Connolly ate it up. He believed he had the best informant in Boston. He was convinced Bulger was helping him build major cases. The truth was darker. Bulger was building an empire, and the FBI was his shield. In 1979, Howie Winter went to prison for fixing horse races. The Winter Hill Gang needed a new leader. Bulger took control. Stephen Flemmi, also an FBI informant since 1965, became his top lieutenant. By the early 1980s, Bulger ran the most sophisticated criminal operation Boston had ever seen. His income streams were diverse and brutal. He shook down drug dealers, charging them rent to operate in South Boston. Kevin Weeks, Bulger's young protege, later estimated that Whitey made about $30 million from this racket alone. Then there was gambling. Bulger controlled bookmaking operations across the city, pulling in an estimated $5 to $7 million. He ran loan sharking operations, charging interest rates that broke bones when payments were late. He muscled into legitimate businesses, forcing owners to sell or cut him in. In 1991, he even forced his way into a share of a $14 million winning Massachusetts lottery ticket. The ticket had been purchased at a store he controlled. Bulger simply told the winners they were now partners. They didn't argue. But all this money, all this power, needed places to operate, and that's where the properties come in. The first major property was Triple O's Lounge at 28 West Broadway in South Boston. Before Kevin O'Neill bought it and renamed it Triple O's, it had been called the Transit Cafe. That was back in the 1960s when Donald Killeen's gang used it as a hangout. After Killeen was machine-gunned to death, O'Neill bought the place. He was a Bulger associate, and he knew exactly what he was buying: a front. Triple O's sat directly across from the Broadway T-stop. The red line rumbled beneath the street. Above ground, the bar looked like any other South Boston dive. Dark interior, small dance floor, pool table, long mirrors on the walls. The real business happened upstairs. Bulger kept an office on the second floor. This was where he held court. Drug dealers came to pay their weekly rent. Bookies brought their earnings. Loan sharks collected envelopes. Bulger sat in that dark room and counted money. Kevin Weeks worked as a bouncer downstairs. He started in 1975, just a 20-year-old kid from the neighborhood. But Bulger saw something in him. By 1978, Weeks was working for Bulger part-time, driving him around, providing muscle when needed. By 1982, Weeks quit his legitimate job. and became a full-time member of the Winter Hill Gang. He ran his own loan sharking operation on the side. Triple O's became legendary in Boston's underworld. On any given night, you might see reputed leaders from crime gangs of every ethnic background walking through that door. Everyone knew what went on upstairs. But here's what made Triple O's so valuable to Bulger. Kevin O'Neill's name was on the liquor license, on the lease, on everything. Bulger's name appeared nowhere. It was the perfect front. Money flowed through that bar in staggering amounts. The monthly take from just the downstairs liquor sales was legitimate income. The money Bulger collected upstairs, that disappeared into the South Boston economy. Some went into safe deposit boxes. Some went into real estate. Some went right back into the street, funding new operations. But Triple O's had a fatal weakness. It could be watched. In 1979 and 1980, Massachusetts State Police managed to plant listening devices in the bar. They captured conversations. They gathered evidence. But then something happened that exposed just how corrupt Bulger's FBI protection really was. In November 1980, FBI Supervisor John Morris accidentally revealed to a Boston police officer that Bulger and his gang knew the bar was bugged. Morris, who was supposed to be overseeing Connolly's handling of Bulger, had become thoroughly compromised himself. Bulger and Flemmy were paying him too. Over the years, they gave Connolly $235,000 in cash. Morris got airline tickets for his girlfriend to visit him in Georgia. He got cases of expensive wine. At Christmas, Morris and Connolly both received envelopes stuffed with cash. Morris was supposed to be the supervisor. Instead, he was on Bulger's payroll. When Bulger learned Triple O's was bugged, he stopped using it for sensitive business. He moved operations. But the bar remained valuable as a public face, a place where Bulger's guys could be seen, a place that said, "We own South Boston." The bar would stay in operation until 2011, the same year Bulger was finally captured. Then it closed. In the years since, it's been an Asian tapas bar, a sushi restaurant, and now it's Fox and the Knife, a James Beard award-winning Italian restaurant. The building still stands at 28 West Broadway. But the ghosts of Triple O's haunt every meal served there. Bulger needed more than just Triple O's, though. He needed a place that nobody was watching, a place where serious business could happen without surveillance. In 1979, the FBI moved their primary operations hub to the Lancaster Street Garage at 131 Lancaster Street near North Station. The garage was officially called Lancaster Foreign Motors, and it was owned by George Kaufman, a close associate of Bulger and Flemmy. During the day, it operated as a normal parking garage, but in the afternoons, it transformed. Bulger and Flemmy would arrive and hold meetings with bookies and mobsters. Kaufman himself acted as a liaison, receiving payments from bookies to minimize law enforcement attention on Flemmy. The Lancaster Street Garage became the business office of the Winter Hill Gang from 1979 to 1980. Criminals from every ethnic background came to meet with Bulger and Flemmy there. It was perfect. Nobody was paying attention to a parking garage, except somebody was. Massachusetts State Police were watching. They planted bugs in the garage. They set up surveillance. Detective Robert Long, who led the surveillance effort, watched Bulger from across the street. Years later, Long would comment that Bulger was always sucking in his stomach, checking out his shoulders, making sure he looked good. Bulger was vain. He bought expensive suits from Louis, a high-end boutique on Newbury Street. He worked out. He watched what he ate. Even in his 50s, he wanted to look dangerous. But the Lancaster Street Garage operation fell apart the same way Triple O's did. John Morris, the corrupt FBI supervisor, told someone that Bulger's gang knew the garage was bugged. Word got back to Bulger. In November 1980, Bulger and Flemmy stopped using the garage. They'd been betrayed again, except it wasn't a betrayal. Morris was protecting them. The FBI had become Bulger's personal security service. After losing both Triple O's and the Lancaster Street Garage to surveillance, Bulger moved his most violent operations to a property that would become infamous, 799 East 3rd Street. The house belonged to Michael Nee, brother of Pat Nee, a member of the Winter Hill Gang. Michael wasn't involved in the gang. He was just a working guy who happened to be Pat's brother. Pat asked to use the house occasionally. Michael said yes. He had no idea what use meant. The house was a two-story Cape Cod built in 1885. It sat in the City Point neighborhood of South Boston, a quiet residential area. The house had 1,975 square feet of living space. But what made it valuable to Bulger was the basement. It was unfinished, just a dirt floor, exposed foundation walls, cold and dark, perfect for burying bodies. The first murder happened in 1983. Arthur "Bucky" Barrett was a safecracker and bar owner. On Memorial Day weekend in 1980, Barrett had participated in stealing $1.5 million from the Depositors Trust Bank in Medford. It was one of the biggest heists in Massachusetts history. Barrett walked away with a fortune, but he made a fatal mistake. He refused to give Bulger a cut. Instead, Barrett paid the patriarch a crime family for protection. That insult ate at Bulger for 3 years. In 1983, Bulger decided it was time to collect. Barrett was lured to 799 East 3rd Street under false pretenses. He walked into that house thinking he was there for a meeting. Instead, they chained him to a chair. For hours, Bulger and Flemmy interrogated him. "Where's the money from the bank job? Where are you hiding it?" Barrett tried to negotiate. He tried to talk his way out. It didn't work. Bulger put a gun to Barrett's head and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed in that small house. Blood splattered across the kitchen floor. And then Bulger did something that revealed just how cold he really was. He went upstairs and took a nap. Downstairs in the basement, Flemmy got to work. He used pliers to remove every one of Barrett's teeth. It took time. It was messy. But Flemmy was thorough. Kevin Weeks and Pat Nee dug a grave in the dirt floor. They buried Arthur Barrett in the basement of Pat's brother's house. Pat Nee later expressed anger that Barrett had been killed. He'd thought this was just going to be an extortion, not a murder. But the house on East 3rd Street had just claimed its first victim. Michael Nee, the owner, was in Florida. He had no idea. The second murder came the following year. John McIntyre was a maritime laborer who'd gotten involved in one of Bulger's most ambitious schemes, gun running to the Irish Republican Army. In 1984, Bulger and Pat Nee loaded the ship Valhalla with 7 tons of weapons bound for Ireland. The operation was supposed to make them heroes in South Boston's Irish community. Instead, it became a disaster. The weapons were seized in Ireland. McIntyre, facing pressure after a drunk driving arrest in Quincy, started talking to the FBI. He confessed to the gun-running operation, but he didn't stop there. He also revealed a 36-ton marijuana smuggling operation that Bulger had been involved in. When Bulger found out McIntyre was cooperating, there was no discussion, no negotiation. McIntyre was lured to 799 East 3rd Street. He was shot and killed. Just like Barrett, his teeth were removed. Just like Barrett, he was buried in the basement dirt floor. Now there were 2 bodies decomposing beneath that house. And still, Michael Nee had no idea. He continued to let his brother Pat use the property. He continued to vacation in Florida. Upstairs, families would eventually live in that house, raising children, celebrating birthdays, completely unaware that beneath their feet lay the remains of 2 men who'd crossed Whitey Bulger. Then came January 14th, 1985, Deborah Hussey's murder, the third and final killing at the house. Kevin Weeks later testified that he'd been shocked by this one. He hadn't known it was coming. Deborah was 26 years old. She was the daughter of Marion Hussey, who was Stephen Flemmy's girlfriend. That made Deborah like a stepdaughter to Flemmy. But Deborah had problems. She was a prostitute. She used drugs. And according to Flemmy, she was talking too much. She knew things about the gang. She was becoming a liability. So Flemmy brought her to the house. Weeks was there. Flemmy told him they were just going to talk to her, scare her straight. But when Bulger's hands wrapped around Deborah's throat, Weeks realized this was no intervention. This was an execution. The strangling should have killed her. But when they carried her down to the basement, Flemmy noticed she was still breathing. He grabbed a rope, fashioned a garrote with a stick, and finished the job. The sound of that rope cutting into her neck echoed in the basement. Then came the routine again. Remove the teeth, remove the clothing, dig the grave, bury the body. 3 graves now in that basement. 3 murders in less than 2 years. The house on East 3rd Street had earned its nickname, the Haunty. Even Bulger, who feared nothing, felt uncomfortable there. Years later, when Kevin Weeks drove him past the house, Bulger would tell him, "Don't ever drive down this street again. I don't like it." The ghosts were real to him. But in 1985, those bodies created a practical problem. Michael Nee decided to sell the house. He was done with South Boston. He wanted to move on, and that meant Barrett, McIntyre, and Hussey needed to move too. It would have been cheaper to just buy the property from Michael, keep it in the family, keep the bodies buried. But for some reason that didn't happen. Instead, in the middle of the night, Bulger, Flemmy, Weeks, and Pat Nee dug up all 3 corpses. The stench must have been overwhelming. Barrett and McIntyre had been in the ground for 2 years and 1 year respectively. Decomposition was well advanced, but they wrapped the remains in plastic, loaded them into cars, and drove them to a new burial site across from Florian Hall in Dorchester. They dug new graves. Phil Costa, a gang associate, brought lime to pour over the bodies. Lime speeds decomposition, helps eliminate odors, makes identification harder. They reburied all 3 bodies in Dorchester and went home. The house on East 3rd Street was now clean, sort of. No bodies. But the dirt floor in the basement still held the residue of 3 murders. Michael Nee sold the property. A wholesome family moved in. They had no idea what had happened in that basement. They raised their kids there. Life went on. For 15 years, those graves in Dorchester kept their secrets. The house on East 3rd Street kept its secrets too. But in December 1994, everything changed. John Connolly, the FBI agent who'd protected Bulger for 20 years, learned that the Justice Department was about to indict Bulger and Flemmy on RICO charges. Connolly, who'd taken $235,000 from Bulger over the years, couldn't let his childhood hero go to prison. He tipped Bulger off. On December 23, 1994, Whitey Bulger disappeared. He was 65 years old. The manhunt began. FBI agents raided Bulger's condominium in South Boston. They found it immaculately clean. Bulger had taken almost nothing with him. What the FBI didn't know was that Bulger had been preparing for this moment for years. He had cash stashed around the country. He had fake identification. He had safe deposit boxes in London, Dublin, Montreal, and Clearwater, Florida. And he had a plan. First, Bulger took his girlfriend Teresa Stanley on what seemed like a vacation. They drove through New York, Chicago, down to Louisiana. But Teresa got homesick. She wanted to go back to Boston. That was a problem. Bulger couldn't take her home without getting arrested, so he called Kevin Weeks. They arranged a meeting at a mall parking lot. Weeks picked up Teresa. Bulger drove away alone. He needed a new companion, someone who wouldn't get homesick. Someone loyal, someone who'd stay with him no matter what. Catherine Gregg was 44 years old, a former dental hygienist, and deeply in love with Whitey Bulger. She'd been his mistress while he was with Teresa. Now Bulger asked her to leave everything behind and join him on the run. She said yes. On January 5, 1995, Catherine Gregg met Bulger at a hotel. She brought 2 suitcases and her small poodles. They drove south. The FBI manhunt intensified. Bulger was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 1999. The reward grew to $2 million. Tips poured in from around the world. Bulger was supposedly spotted in London in 2002. Someone claimed to see him in Italy. Others said he was in Ireland or South America or Canada. The FBI chased every lead. Every single one was wrong. Because Whitey Bulger and Catherine Gregg were not hiding in some exotic location. They were living in Santa Monica, California, in a rent-controlled apartment that cost $1,145 a month. They'd been there since 1996, and nobody had any idea. The Princess Eugenia Apartments at 1012 3rd Street in Santa Monica looked like any other Southern California apartment building. 3 stories, pale exterior, nothing remarkable. Unit 303 was a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment on the 3rd floor. It had beige carpeting, white walls, and a small brick fireplace. When Bulger and Gregg moved in, the rent was only $837 a month. Rent control kept it low. They gave their names as Charles and Carol Gasco. Bulger had obtained a Social Security number from a homeless man he'd met in a park. He said he'd taken out identification under that name. He created a fake military service certificate, fake birth certificates, everything needed to become Charlie Gasco. The apartment was close to everything, 2 blocks from the Santa Monica Pier, walking distance to the 3rd Street Promenade, near the beach, near the library, near restaurants and stores. Bulger, now living as Charlie Gasco, fell into a routine. He read constantly. Military history, war chronicles, crime novels. He subscribed to magazines about weapons and warfare. He stocked up on hand soap and cleaning supplies, buying in bulk like he was preparing for the apocalypse. He had framed pictures of cats on the walls. He and Catherine slept in separate bedrooms. They walked to the beach regularly. They strolled the Santa Monica Pier. They ate at local restaurants. Catherine went to the same beauty salon every month. She got her teeth cleaned monthly, too. She was fastidious about appearance. This was important later. From the outside, the Gascos looked like any elderly retired couple. Charlie was cantankerous. Neighbors described him as unfriendly. He didn't make small talk. He wore a mustache and reading glasses. He kept his famous platinum blonde hair dyed dark. But Catherine was friendly. She smiled at people. She chatted with neighbors about the weather. Together they created the perfect disguise. Boring senior citizens living quiet lives in a rent-controlled apartment. What nobody saw was what happened inside apartment 303. Bulger had been cutting holes in the walls. Not big, obvious holes. Small, neat openings hidden behind furniture, behind pictures, behind mirrors. Into these holes, he stuffed his life. He wrapped cash in plastic bags and shoved bundles into the walls. Most of the bills were hundreds, but they were all dated to 1995 or earlier. Bulger worried that newer bills with updated security features might draw attention if he tried to spend them. By 2011, he'd accumulated $822,198 in cash hidden in those walls. That's $822,000 in $100 bills, all pre-1996. He'd been living on it for 15 years. The walls also held his arsenal, 30 firearms, handguns, rifles, ammunition, knives, what appeared to be a hand grenade, handcuffs, everything a man might need if the FBI finally found him. One hole was covered by a mirror. Above the mirror, Bulger had hung a crucifix. It was like a religious joke. The sacred hiding the profane. But Bulger and Greg's life wasn't entirely confined to the apartment. They traveled. They drove to Las Vegas regularly to gamble at casinos. Bulger played the slot machines. He was good at it, or at least lucky. He won more than he lost. This served 2 purposes. It gave him something to do, and it helped launder money. He'd arrive with outdated hundreds, play the slots, cash out with newer bills from the casino. Simple money laundering through gambling. They also traveled to other cities occasionally, always paying cash, never leaving a digital trail. But Santa Monica was home base. For 15 years, this apartment was their sanctuary, just 2 blocks from the beach, 2 blocks from thousands of tourists every single day. Whitey Bulger was living in one of the most visible neighborhoods in Los Angeles County, and nobody recognized him. Except somebody did. Anna Bjornsdottir had been Miss Iceland in 1974. By 2011, she was living in Santa Monica, working as a makeup artist. She had a habit of feeding stray cats around the neighborhood. So did Catherine Gregg. One of those cats, a black and white stray, became a bond between them. They'd see each other occasionally, chat briefly about the cat. Anna thought Carol Gasco was pleasant enough. She didn't pay much attention to the older couple. Then, in mid-June 2011, the FBI launched a new publicity campaign. For years, they'd focused on finding Whitey Bulger himself. Now, they changed strategy. They focused on Catherine Gregg. The FBI produced television spots asking people to look for an older woman who loved going to beauty salons, who had her teeth cleaned regularly, who cared about her appearance. The spots ran during daytime television shows. The View, Ellen, shows with large female audiences. On June 20th, 2011, Anna Bjornsdottir saw one of these spots. She stopped breathing. That woman, that description, that face in the photo. It was Carol from the apartment building. Carol who fed the stray cat. Anna called the FBI tip line. She told them about Carol Gasco. She told them about Charlie. She gave them the address. The FBI verified the tip. They staked out the Princess Eugenia apartments. They watched the elderly couple come and go. They confirmed it was really Bulger and Grigg. After 16 years, they'd finally found him. On June 22nd, 2011, the FBI set up their trap. They didn't want to raid the apartment. Bulger had 30 guns in there. A shootout in a residential building could kill innocent people. They needed to get him outside. Josh Bond was the building manager. FBI agents approached him with a plan. Bond would call the Gascos and tell them there was a problem with their storage locker in the parking garage. Could they come down to look at it? Bond made the call. A few minutes later, Charlie and Carol Gasco walked down to the garage. It was a warm Southern California evening, 6:47 p.m. They had no idea anything was wrong. As they entered the garage, FBI agents surrounded them. Black SUVs blocked the exits. Agents emerged with weapons drawn. FBI, get on the ground! Charlie Gasco reached into his pocket. Agents shouted louder. For a moment, it looked like Whitey Bulger, at 81 years old, was going to try to shoot it out with the FBI. But then he stopped. His hand came out of his pocket empty. He looked at the agents. There were too many guns, too many years. He raised his hands. An agent asked him to identify himself. Bulger first claimed he was Charlie Gasco, but the agent persisted. Finally, Bulger said the words that ended it all. You know who I am? I'm Whitey Bulger. 16 years on the run, captured without a shot fired. Catherine Grigg stood next to him, crying. They were both handcuffed and led to separate vehicles. FBI agents swarmed apartment 303. What they found inside stunned them. They started carefully removing items. Evidence bags piled up. First came the weapons, 30 firearms. An agent later described it as an arsenal. There were handguns of various calibers. There was a knife collection. There was ammunition. There was what appeared to be a hand grenade, though it was later determined to be inactive. Then they found the cash. The first hole was behind a mirror in the living room. Agents lifted the mirror. Inside the wall was plastic-wrapped money, bundles and bundles of $100 bills. They found more holes, behind furniture, in the closet, in the bedroom. Every hole contained more cash. By the end of the search, they'd recovered $822,198, all in cash, all pre-1996 bills. The FBI also found identification documents, multiple fake IDs under the Gasco name, birth certificates, Social Security cards, a fake military service certificate. Everything Bulger had used to become someone else for 15 years. Agents spent all day removing evidence from the apartment. The building's other tenants watched in shock. That quiet old man was Whitey Bulger? That pleasant woman was harboring a fugitive? The story made international headlines. America's most wanted gangster had been living in a rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica the entire time the FBI had been searching Europe and South America for him. It was embarrassing for the FBI. But it was over. Whitey Bulger was finally in custody. Back in Boston, the news triggered a reckoning. Kevin Weeks, who'd been Bulger's protege and right-hand man, had already cut a deal with prosecutors years earlier. In 1999, after Bulger fled, Weeks had been arrested. Facing life in prison, he decided to cooperate. He'd led police to 6 burial sites around Boston. In 2000, he took them to the spot across from Florian Hall in Dorchester. They dug up Arthur Barrett, John McIntyre, and Deborah Hussey, the 3 bodies from the Haunty. Weeks also revealed burial sites for 3 other victims. He testified that he'd personally witnessed 11 murders. He described in detail what had happened in the basement of 799 East 3rd Street. His testimony was crucial. Without it, prosecutors would never have connected Bulger to those specific murders. Weeks served only 5 years for being an accessory to 5 murders. He was released in 2005. He wrote a book called Brutal: The Untold Story of My Life Inside Whitey Bulger's Irish Mob. It became a bestseller. When Bulger's trial began in 2013, Weeks was called as a prosecution witness. The 2 men hadn't seen each other since 1994. Bulger sat at the defense table, now 83 years old. Weeks took the stand. The animosity was immediate. Weeks called Bulger a rat, the worst insult in their world. Bulger lunged toward him. Marshals had to restrain him. The two men, once like brothers, now hated each other with a purity that shocked the courtroom. The trial of James Joseph Bulger began on June 12, 2013, in federal court in Boston. Judge Denise Casper presided. The prosecution called 72 witnesses. They presented evidence of 19 murders, drug trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and racketeering. The litany of violence was staggering. The prosecution described how Bulger had strangled, shot, and beaten his victims. They presented evidence from the basement of 799 East 3rd Street. Forensic experts testified about the 3 bodies found in Dorchester. John Martirano, a Winter Hill Gang hitman who'd admitted to 20 murders, testified against Bulger. Kevin Weeks testified for 6 days. He described murders in detail. He described the money, the properties, the operations. He described how Bulger had built an empire protected by corrupt FBI agents. The defense tried to argue that Bulger had been given immunity by the Justice Department through his FBI handler. They claimed he couldn't be prosecuted because he'd been working for the government. Judge Casper rejected this argument. No prosecutor or judge had ever given Bulger immunity. What he'd had was protection from corrupt agents, not legal immunity. The jury deliberated for 32 hours over 5 days. On August 12, 2013, they returned their verdict. Guilty on 31 of 32 counts, guilty of racketeering, guilty of 11 murders, not guilty of 1 murder, insufficient evidence to make a determination on 7 others, no finding on 1 additional killing. But the core verdict was clear. Whitey Bulger was a murderer and a racketeer. On November 14, 2013, Judge Casper sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. Bulger, now 84, would die in prison. He'd never be free again. The families of his victims attended the sentencing. They'd waited decades for this moment. Some gave victim impact statements. Pat Donahue's widow spoke about her husband Michael, who'd been killed in 1982 as an innocent bystander in a mob hit. She'd raised her 3 sons alone. Steve Davis spoke about his sister Deborah, who'd been 26 when Bulger strangled her in the kitchen of the Haunty. He'd spent years investigating her disappearance himself, not trusting the FBI or Boston police. Now, finally, there was justice. Sort of. Many families felt the government's settlement offers were insultingly low. The government had seized Bulger's assets, including the $822,000 from the Santa Monica apartment. But victims' families had to fight for every dollar. Some received between $1 and $2.5 million. Others got nothing. The legal battles over Bulger's remaining assets continue to this day. Catherine Grigg, who'd spent 15 years on the run with Bulger, was sentenced to 8 years in prison for harboring a fugitive. She was released in 2020. She denied having any knowledge of where additional Bulger money might be hidden. Most people don't believe her. The properties themselves met different fates. Triple O's Lounge closed in 2011. For a brief time, it became an Asian tapas bar. Then a sushi restaurant called The Maiden opened there in 2017. It closed in 2018. Now it's Fox and the Knife, a celebrated Italian restaurant that won chef Karen Akonowitz a James Beard Award. The building looks the same from the outside, but inside it's been completely renovated. There's no trace of the dark bar where Bulger held court for 20 years. Tourists sometimes stop by looking for the ghost of Triple O's. They're disappointed to find Michelin-quality pasta instead of mob history. The Santa Monica apartment at 1012 3rd Street went back on the rental market after the FBI investigation concluded. The holes in the walls were patched and painted. By 2014, the apartment was renting for $2,950 a month, nearly triple what Bulger had paid. The building management didn't advertise its connection to Whitey Bulger. They just wanted tenants who'd pay rent on time. Some tourists still visit the building, taking photos from the street, but there's no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate that America's most wanted fugitive lived there for 15 years. The building manager at the time, Josh Bond, who'd helped the FBI trap Bulger, quit shortly after. He was uncomfortable with the attention. And then there's 7999 East 3rd Street, the Haunty. After Kevin Weeks revealed the location of the 3 murders, the property became infamous. The family that had been living there, who'd had no idea about the basement's history, were devastated. They'd raised their children in that house. They'd celebrated Christmas there. And beneath their feet, 3 murder victims had been buried for years. The property changed hands eventually. In July 2019, it was listed for sale. The asking price was $3.5 million. This was South Boston, which by then had gentrified dramatically. The Seaport District, once a collection of empty warehouses, had become luxury condos and tech companies. South Boston property values had skyrocketed. But 799 East 3rd Street had a problem. It was famous for all the wrong reasons. The listing price was reduced to $3,395,000. It went under agreement. Then something happened that surprised many people. The new buyers went to the Boston Landmarks Commission and requested permission to demolish the house. On December 13, 2019, the commission approved the demolition. They ruled that the house was not significant historically. Some people were outraged. This was the site of 3 murders. It was part of Boston's criminal history. Shouldn't it be preserved or at least marked? Others were relieved. Why preserve a place associated with so much violence? The demolition went forward. The house where Arthur Barrett, John McIntyre, and Deborah Hussey were murdered and buried was torn down. Plans were approved for a 9,766 square foot development with 4 townhouse units and 8 garage parking spots. By 2021, construction was complete. The Haunty no longer exists. New families live there now. They probably don't know the history, or if they do, they don't talk about it. Whitey Bulger's own story ended violently, as perhaps it had to. On October 29, 2018, he was transferred from a prison in Florida to U.S. Penitentiary Hazleton in West Virginia. He was 89 years old, in poor health, confined to a wheelchair. He'd been in federal custody for 7 years. Prison officials placed him in general population despite warnings that he was a target. Other inmates knew who he was, knew he'd been an FBI informant. That made him a rat. The worst thing you can be in prison. Less than 12 hours after arriving at Hazleton, Bulger was dead. On the morning of October 30th, 2018, at approximately 8:20 a.m., several inmates attacked him in his cell. They beat him with a lock stuffed into a sock. They beat him so severely that his eyes were nearly gouged out. By the time guards found him, he was already dead. He was 89 years old. The attack was captured on security cameras, but the cameras had been positioned so they couldn't see inside the cells. Convenient. 3 inmates were eventually charged with the murder. Fotayo's Freddie Gayash, a Massachusetts organized crime figure, was believed to be the primary attacker. Paul DeCologero, a member of a North Shore gang, was charged as well. Sean McKinnon, who was accused of acting as a lookout, was also charged. In September 2023, Gayash and DeCologero pleaded guilty to charges related to Bulger's murder. They admitted they'd planned and carried out the attack because Bulger was a government informant. The code of the criminal world had reached Bulger even at age 89 in a West Virginia prison. He'd spent his entire life enforcing that code. He'd murdered people for being rats. In the end, the same label killed him. The financial trail of Bulger's empire remains murky. The government officially seized approximately $3 million in assets. The $822,000 from Santa Monica was the largest single recovery. They also found $50,000 in a safety deposit box in London, $10,000 in Dublin, and smaller amounts elsewhere. But everyone involved believes Bulger hid much more. His criminal career spanned 40 years. Conservative estimates put his total illegal income at $30 to $50 million. Some estimates go higher. Where did all that money go? Some went to maintaining his lifestyle. Some went to bribing FBI agents and police officers, but millions remain unaccounted for. Kevin Weeks believes there are buried caches of cash around Boston. Bulger was paranoid about banks and paper trails. He preferred to bury money in waterproof containers. Weeks helped him bury some of it, but was never told about all the locations. After Bulger fled in 1994, Weeks went looking for these caches. He found some. He dug up hundreds of thousands of dollars that Bulger had hidden. But Weeks believes there's more, much more, buried in places only Whitey Bulger knew about. And Whitey took those secrets to his grave. The properties that Whitey Bulger used to build his empire tell a story about power, corruption, and violence. Triple O's was the public face, the place where everyone could see the Winter Hill Gang's influence. The Lancaster Street garage was the business office, where deals were made and money changed hands until surveillance forced them out. And 799 East 3rd Street, the Haunty, was the place where problems were permanently solved. 3 different properties, 3 different functions, all part of the same brutal enterprise. But the Santa Monica apartment might be the most revealing of all. For 15 years, Whitey Bulger lived in that modest 2-bedroom unit with $822,000 in the walls. He could have fled to Brazil, to Thailand, to anywhere in the world. Instead, he stayed in Santa Monica, walking the pier, reading his books, living quietly. Why? Some believe he couldn't stand to be far from Boston, even though he couldn't return. Santa Monica was still America. It was still close enough. Others think he was simply tired. At 65, when he fled, he may have decided that a quiet life was worth more than continuing to run. Or maybe he believed his FBI protection would last forever, that somehow, even on the run, Connolly and Morris would keep him safe. They couldn't. By 2011, both Connolly and Morris had been prosecuted for their corruption. Connolly was in federal prison himself. Morris had testified against him in exchange for immunity. The FBI had cleaned house. The corrupt agents who'd protected Bulger for 20 years were gone. There was no one left to warn him when Anna Bjornsdottir called the tip line. On that June evening in 2011, when FBI agents pulled Charlie Gasco's hands behind his back and cuffed them, a 40-year criminal empire officially ended. Bulger had started as a teenage thief in Dorchester. He'd survived prison, gang wars, and decades of criminal competition. He'd built a network of properties, businesses, and corrupt officials that made him untouchable in Boston. He'd killed at least 19 people, probably more. He'd made tens of millions of dollars, and he'd done it all while being protected by the very agency that was supposed to stop him. The FBI's Boston field office had become, essentially, Bulger's private security service. That betrayal of public trust was almost as shocking as the murders themselves. When the truth came out, it damaged the FBI's reputation for years. Congressional hearings were held. Internal investigations were launched. The question everyone asked was, how did this happen? How did a gangster manipulate the FBI so completely? The answer was simple and depressing. Corruption. Personal relationships. Money. John Connolly had genuinely believed he was controlling Bulger as an informant. He thought he was using Bulger to take down the Italian Mafia. He told his supervisors that Bulger was giving them valuable intelligence. And Bulger did give them some good information. He helped the FBI prosecute members of the Patriarca crime family. But every piece of information Bulger provided served his own interests. He eliminated Italian competitors. He eliminated Irish rivals who might have cooperated with police. He used the FBI as a weapon against everyone who stood in his way. And the FBI let him because they wanted big cases, big headlines, and big wins. They were willing to overlook Bulger's crimes to get intelligence on other criminals. Except Bulger's crimes included murder. Lots of murder. By protecting him, the FBI became complicit in those murders. Judge Mark Wolf, who presided over some of the early corruption hearings, was scathing in his assessment. In 1998, he issued a ruling that exposed the depth of FBI corruption in Boston. He found that FBI agents had accepted bribes, leaked confidential information, and protected informants who were committing murders. Judge Wolf's ruling opened the floodgates. Victims' families sued the federal government. Some won multi-million-dollar settlements. The cases dragged on for years. In 2022, 14 years after Bulger's trial, his estate was still in litigation. Victims' families were still fighting over the remaining seized assets. The government had made settlement offers, but many families rejected them as too low. They wanted everything, every dollar Bulger had hidden, every asset he'd ever touched. They felt they were owed that much for the years of pain, the years of waiting, the years of watching the FBI protect the man who'd killed their loved ones. Can money replace a murdered husband? A strangled daughter? A son shot in the head? No, but for many families it was the only justice left. Bulger was dead. The corrupt FBI agents had been prosecuted. The only thing remaining was money. The real estate at 799 East 3rd Street, assessed by the city at $899,000 in 2019, sold for well over $3 million before demolition. That money went to the new developers, not to victims' families. They had no claim on it. Michael Nee's brother had owned the property. The Nee family was never charged with any crimes related to the murders. They genuinely had no idea what Bulger and Flemmy were doing in that basement. The new townhouses built on the site will probably sell for over $1 million each. 4 units, each worth at least $1 million, sitting on land where 3 people were tortured and murdered. That's South Boston in the 21st century. The old neighborhood where everyone knew everyone and secret stayed secret is gone. Now it's young professionals, tech workers, and families who have no connection to the old days. They buy million-dollar townhouses without knowing what happened there, or maybe they do know and don't care. The past is past, the property value is present, and in real estate, the past is always negotiable. The story of Whitey Bulger's properties is ultimately a story about hiding in plain sight. Triple O's look like any other neighborhood bar. The Lancaster Street garage looked like a parking garage. The house on East 3rd Street looked like a family home. And the Santa Monica apartment looked like a retirement complex. None of them advertised what they really were. That was the genius of Bulger's operation. He didn't build mansions. He didn't draw attention. He used ordinary places for extraordinary crimes. Even his 16 years on the run followed this pattern. While the FBI searched exotic locations, Bulger was living in a rent-controlled apartment, walking to the beach, reading his books. He hid by being boring, by being old, by being invisible. It almost worked. If Catherine Grigg hadn't cared so much about her appearance, if she hadn't gone to beauty salons and dental cleaning so regularly, if the FBI hadn't focused on her instead of him, he might still be living in Santa Monica today. At 89, he could have died peacefully in that apartment, and no one would have known that Charlie Gasco was really Whitey Bulger. But secrets have a way of coming out. Arthur Barrett's family deserved to know what happened to him. John McIntyre's family deserved closure. Deborah Hussey's brother Steve Davis spent years searching for her, never giving up, never accepting that she'd just vanished. When Kevin Weeks finally told authorities where the bodies were buried, when those graves were opened and the remains identified, it brought those families a measure of peace. Not justice, really. Justice would have been Deborah Hussey growing old, raising her own children. Justice would have been Arthur Barrett spending his bank heist money on stupid things and eventually getting caught and going to prison but staying alive. Justice would have been John McIntyre doing his time for the gun running and getting out and living the rest of his life. Instead, all 3 ended up in unmarked graves, their teeth removed, buried in dirt floors and vacant lots. That's not justice. That's just violence. But at least their families got to bury them properly. At least they got to know the truth. Today, if you walk down West Broadway in South Boston, you can eat at Fox and the Knife, where Triple O's once stood. The food is excellent. The restaurant has won national awards. Chef Karen Akunowicz has created something beautiful in a place that was once filled with ugliness. If you walk to 3rd Street in Santa Monica, you can see the Princess Eugenia apartments. It looks the same as it did when Whitey Bulger lived there. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. And if you go to the corner of East 3rd Street in South Boston, you'll find 4 modern townhouses where the Haunty used to stand. Clean, new, expensive, no ghosts visible. But they're there. They're always there. 3 people died in that basement, their blood soaked into that dirt floor. And no amount of construction, no amount of gentrification, no amount of time can completely erase that history. The buildings may change, the neighborhoods may transform, but what happened in those places remains. Whitey Bulger is dead now. He died violently, beaten to death by inmates who saw him as a rat, the same label he'd used to justify killing others. There's a certain symmetry to it, a man who lived by violence, who built an empire on murder and extortion, who strangled a 26-year-old woman in a kitchen and then went upstairs to take a nap, died the same way his victims did. Suddenly, brutally, without mercy. The properties he used are gone or transformed. Triple O's is a restaurant. The Santa Monica apartment is just another rental. The hauntee has been demolished. Even his own corpse has been cremated, ashes scattered to the wind. There's no grave to visit, no marker, just memories and court documents and testimony from men like Kevin Weeks, who watched it all happen and said nothing for years. The only thing left is the money. Somewhere out there, buried in waterproof containers or hidden in secret bank accounts, millions of dollars from Whitey Bulger's 40-year criminal career are waiting to be found. Maybe someone will dig them up someday. Maybe they'll rot in the ground forever. Either way, it doesn't matter to Whitey Bulger anymore. He's beyond caring, beyond reach, beyond justice. All that's left are the stories, the properties, the graves, and the question that haunts everyone who studies his life. How did he get away with it for so long? How did one man manipulate the FBI, murder 19 people, make $50 million, and live free for 81 years before spending his final 7 years in prison? The answer is in those properties, in the dark office above Triple O's where he collected payments, in the garage where he held business meetings, in the basement where he buried bodies, and in the Santa Monica apartment where he hid $822,000 in the walls and thought he'd never be caught. Each property was a piece of a larger machine designed to generate money, eliminate threats, and maintain power. Together, they formed the infrastructure of an empire built on fear, corruption, and murder, an empire that lasted 4 decades, an empire that ended in a Santa Monica parking garage on a warm June evening when an 81-year-old man finally admitted who he really was. The properties tell the story, if you know how to read them, and now you do.